I'm about to reveal a secret I've kept for years. I, Sarah Thompson, a city girl who dreamed of a quiet life in the countryside, ended up living a story that seemed straight out of a soap opera. But let me tell you from the beginning, because every detail is important to understand how I got to where I am now. It all started 5 years ago, when I met Jack at an agricultural fair in the city. I worked as an event organizer, and he was there representing his family's farm. Our eyes met between tractors and organic vegetable stands, and it was as if the world stopped for a moment. Jack was tall, broad-shouldered, with a smile that lit up his whole face. I approached his stand with the excuse of trying some of his products, and we ended up talking for hours. We fell in love quickly. Jack was different from any man I had met before. He had a passion for the land and a way of seeing life that completely captivated me. After 6 months of dating, he proposed to me under a starry sky on his farm. I didn't hesitate for a second to say yes. We got married in an intimate ceremony, in the chapel of the town near the farm. I was radiant in my white dress, surrounded by wildflowers, and with the love of my life by my side. I remember the look of pride in Robert's eyes, Jack's father, when he gave us his blessing. At that moment I felt that I had found not only my husband, but also a new family. The first months on the farm were like a dream. I fell in love with rural life. The sun rises over the wheat fields, the smell of wet earth after the rain. Jack taught me how to ride a horse, milk cows, and even drive a tractor. I helped where I could, learning the family business and trying to fit into this new life. Robert, my father-in-law, was a great help in my adaptation. He was a man in his mid-50s, widowed for a long time, with a wisdom that only comes from years of working the land. He taught me the secrets of his garden, how to predict the weather by looking at the sky, and 1,001 stories about the farm and his family. We spent hours talking while working together, and little by little, he became a friend and confidant. However, as time passed, I began to notice changes in Jack. The long working days on the farm left him exhausted, and we spent less and less time together. Our conversations were limited to practical topics about the farm, and romantic nights under the stars became scarce. I tried to talk to him about my feelings, but he always had an excuse: the harvest, the animals, the bills to pay. I felt increasingly lonely and abandoned. I missed the connection we had at the beginning, that spark that had made me leave everything for him. I started to seek comfort in my conversations with Robert. He always had time to listen to me, to offer a kind word or wise advice. I don't know exactly when my feelings for Robert began to change. Maybe it was that afternoon when he found me crying in the barn, and hugged me, offering the comfort I so desperately needed. Or perhaps it was during those nights when Jack came home late, and we had dinner together, sharing laughs and memories. What I do know is that, little by little, I started to see Robert differently. I felt guilty about these thoughts, but I couldn't help them. Robert was attentive, caring, and made me feel valued. I compared his treatment with Jack's growing indifference, and my heart became increasingly divided. One night, after a particularly heated argument with Jack about his lack of attention, I went out for a walk to clear my head. My steps led me to the old oak tree at the edge of the property, where I used to go to think. To my surprise, Robert was there, contemplating the stars. I sat down beside him in silence, letting the tears run down my cheeks. Without saying a word, Robert put his arm around me, offering the comfort I so desperately needed. I looked up, and our eyes met. I don't know who made the first move, but suddenly we were kissing under the moonlight. It was a kiss laden with conflicting emotions: passion, guilt, desire, and fear. When we separated, we both knew we had crossed a line we shouldn't have crossed. We looked at each other in silence, aware of the gravity of what had just happened. "This is wrong, Sarah," Robert whispered, his voice trembling. "You're my son's wife." "I know," I replied, feeling tears welling up again, "but I can't deny what I feel." That night marked the beginning of a clandestine relationship that would last for months. We met in secret, stealing moments behind Jack's back. Guilt was eating me up inside, but at the same time, the moments with Robert were the only ones where I felt truly alive. Jack remained absorbed in his work, apparently oblivious to what was happening under his own roof. Or so we thought. The truth is that guilt made us careless, and rumors began to circulate among the farm workers. It was Mike, one of the oldest farmhands, who finally decided to talk to Jack. I remember that day as if it were yesterday. I was in the kitchen preparing dinner when I heard the noise of a car arriving at full speed. Jack stormed in, his face contorted, and his eyes bloodshot. "Is it true?" he yelled at me, grabbing me by the shoulders. "Is what Mike says true?" I couldn't answer. The words got stuck in my throat as I watched the world we had built crumble before my eyes. My silence was all the confirmation Jack needed. What followed was an explosion of shouting, crying, and recriminations. Robert entered the kitchen, drawn by the commotion, and the situation worsened. Father and son confronted each other, saying things that could never be taken back. I stood there paralyzed, watching as I destroyed not only my marriage but also the relationship between a father and his son. That night, Jack packed his bags and left the farm. He didn't say where he was going, only that he couldn't stay under the same roof as us. I watched him leave with a broken heart, knowing I was responsible for his pain. The following days were a whirlwind of emotions. Robert and I tried to continue our relationship, but the weight of what we had done was too great. Every corner of the farm reminded me of Jack. Every look from the workers was loaded with judgment. I felt trapped in a nightmare, from which I couldn't wake up. Finally, after weeks of agony, the divorce papers arrived. Jack had sent them by mail, not even bothering to come in person. I signed with trembling hands, aware that I was putting an end to what had once been the dream of my life. Guilt and shame consumed me. I couldn't look at Robert without thinking about the damage we had caused. Our relationship, which had once been a refuge, now felt like a prison. I realized that, despite my feelings for him, what we had was wrong from the beginning. One morning, I made the most difficult decision of my life. I told Robert the first was leaving, that I couldn't stay on the farm. He tried to convince me to stay, that we could overcome this together, but I knew it was impossible. I needed to get away from everything to find myself again. With a broken heart and a suitcase full of remorse, I left behind the farm that had been my home for the last few years. I didn't have a plan, I just knew I needed to escape, to find a place where I could breathe without feeling the weight of my mistakes on my shoulders. For the next year, I traveled aimlessly. I worked in hostels, in cafes, anywhere that would allow me to earn enough to keep moving. Each new city, each new face was an opportunity to forget, if only for a moment, the damage I had caused, but the past has a way of catching up with us, no matter how far we try to run. In every relationship I tried to form, in every connection I tried to establish, the ghost of what I had done stood in the way. I realized I couldn't keep running forever. I needed to face my mistakes, learn from them, and somehow find forgiveness. It was then that I decided to return to my hometown of Oakville, Illinois. The place where I had grown up, where my parents still lived, where the roots of my identity were deeply embedded. I arrived on an autumn afternoon, with leaves falling around me as a reminder of the passage of time and the changes that had occurred in my life. My parents welcomed me with a mixture of relief and concern. They knew part of what had happened, but not everything. I told them my story, omitting nothing, letting the tears flow freely as I confessed my mistakes. To my surprise, they didn't judge me. They hugged me, offered me their unconditional love, and told me they were proud that I had found the courage to face my past. Little by little, I began to rebuild my life in Oakville. I got a job at the small local bookstore, a quiet place where I could immerse myself in other people's stories, and at the same time, reflect on my own. Books became my companions, my teachers. Through them I began to better understand my actions, my motivations, and the complexities of the human heart. It wasn't easy. There were days when the weight of my memories crushed me, when guilt threatened to drown me, but there were also moments of clarity, of understanding. I began to see that, although my actions had been wrong, my feelings had been real. I had sought love and connection in the wrong places, but that search itself didn't make me a bad person. Over time, I dared to form new friendships in Oakville. At first, I feared that my past would haunt me, that rumors of what I had done would reach there, but I discovered that most people were more interested in who I was now than in who I had been. Little by little, I began to feel part of a community again. One afternoon, while organizing books in the store, I came across a novel that told a story surprisingly similar to mine. I read it in one sitting, feeling a deep connection with the protagonist. Upon finishing, I made a decision, I would write my own story. I began writing every night, pouring onto paper my experiences, my emotions, my reflections. It wasn't easy to relive certain moments, but I discovered that the act of writing had a cathartic effect. As the words flowed, I felt as if I was freeing myself from a weight I had carried for too long. As I wrote, I also began to wonder about Jack and Robert. What had become of them? Had they managed to reconcile? Curiosity and the need to close that chapter of my life led me to make another difficult decision. I would contact them. First, I wrote to Jack. The letter took me days to finish. I wanted to express my sincere regret, ask for forgiveness without excusing myself, and at the same time, not reopen old wounds. Finally, I sent it not knowing if I would get a response. To my surprise, Jack responded. His letter was brief but kind. He told me he had left the farm, that he now lived in the city and worked as an agricultural engineer. He had found a new partner and was trying to rebuild his life. His words weren't full of forgiveness, but neither were they full of resentment. He wished me the best and thanked me for having the courage to contact him. Contacting Robert was even more difficult. Part of me feared that my feelings for him might resurface. But I knew I needed this conversation to be able to move forward. I wrote him an email, asking if we could talk on the phone. The call was intense and emotional. Robert told me he had sold the farm shortly after I left. He couldn't bear to live there with all the memories. He had moved to a coastal town, where he now worked as an agricultural consultant. He told me he had tried to reconcile with Jack, but the relationship between them was still strained. We talked for hours, remembering the good and the bad, crying and laughing at times. In the end, we both recognized that what we had was a mistake, but also that it had been real. We said goodbye with a mixture of sadness and relief, knowing that this was the true end of our story. These conversations, although difficult, helped me close an important chapter in my life. I realized that, although I couldn't change the past, I could learn from it and use it to build a better future. I continued writing my story, now with a new perspective. It was no longer just a tale of betrayal and guilt, but also of growth and redemption. As the pages accumulated, I felt I was creating more than just a book. I was creating a testimony of my personal journey, a guide for others who might find themselves in similar situations. One day, while walking through the town park, I ran into Emily, an old school friend. We caught up, and when I told her I was writing a book, she seemed genuinely interested. Emily worked as an editor at a small local publishing house, and encouraged me to send her my manuscript when I finished. Months of hard work, rewrites, and revisions passed. Each word was carefully chosen, each scene meticulously constructed. Finally, with my heart in my throat, I sent the manuscript to Emily. The weeks of waiting were agonizing. I wondered if I had done the right thing by exposing my story in that way. What if people judged me? What if Jack or found out and felt betrayed again? When Emily called to tell me they wanted to publish my book, I felt a mixture of euphoria and terror. It was a dream come true, but it also meant that my story, with all its imperfections and mistakes, would be out there for the world to see. The publication process was an emotional roller coaster. Each stage, from editing to cover design, made me relive different aspects of my experience. But I also realized that, with each step, I felt lighter, more at peace with myself. The day of the book launch came faster than I expected. The small bookstore where I worked organized a presentation. To my surprise, the place was packed. There were familiar faces, my parents, friends from Oakville, even some regular customers from the bookstore. But there were also new faces, people who had read about the event and were intrigued by the story. As I read an excerpt from the book, I felt something change inside me. I was no longer the scared and guilt-ridden woman who had returned to Oakville a few years ago. I was someone who had faced her demons, who had found the strength to tell her truth. The questions from the audience were varied. Some people wanted to know more about the details of the story, others were interested in the writing process. But the question that impacted me the most came from a young woman in the back. "How did you find the strength to forgive yourself?" she asked with a trembling voice. I took a moment before answering, aware that my response could be important, not only for her, but for many others in the room. "Forgiveness," I began, "is not something that happens overnight, it's a process, a journey. For me, it began when I stopped running from my mistakes and decided to face them. Writing this book, was part of that process. It forced me to look honestly at my actions, to understand my motivations without excusing them. But the most important thing was realizing that, although I can't change the past, I can learn from it, and use it to be a better person in the present and in the future. I saw tears in the eyes of some people as I spoke, and I knew my words had touched something deep in them. Maybe, I thought, that was the true purpose of sharing my story, helping others find forgiveness and redemption in their own lives. After the presentation, as I signed books and talked with readers, I felt overwhelmed by the warmth and support I received. Many people shared with me their own stories of mistakes and second chances. I realized that by exposing my vulnerability, I had created a space where others felt safe to do the same. In the months that followed, I received numerous emails and letters from readers across the country. Some thanked me for my honesty, others shared how my story had given them hope in their own struggles. Each message reminded me that, although our actions can have painful consequences, there is always a path to redemption if we are willing to do the hard work of facing ourselves. One day, while organizing some books in the store, I received an unexpected call. It was Jack. My heart raced as I heard his voice. "I've read your book," he told me after a moment of awkward silence. I braced myself for the worst, fearing he might be angry that I had exposed our story. "I wanted to tell you that. It has helped me understand many things," he continued. "It wasn't easy to read, but I think it was necessary. Thank you for your honesty." Tears were running down my cheeks as we talked. It wasn't complete forgiveness, but it was a step towards mutual understanding. Jack told me that the book had given him the courage to talk to his father, to try to rebuild their relationship. It wasn't a fairy tale happy ending, he told me, but they were working on it. That conversation made me realize something important. True redemption isn't just about forgiving ourselves, but also about repairing, as much as possible, the damage we've caused to others. I couldn't undo my past actions, but I could use my experience to help others heal. Inspired by this idea, I began offering therapeutic writing workshops at the bookstore. Each week, a diverse group of people gathered to write about their experiences, their struggles, and their hopes. Seeing how writing helped them process their emotions and find clarity in their lives filled me with a sense of purpose I had never experienced before. As time passed, I felt I was writing a new chapter in my own life. One centered on growth, compassion, and service to others. I no longer defined myself by my past mistakes, but by what I was doing to create a positive impact in the present. One day, as I walked through Oakville, I stopped in front of the old church where I had married Jack years ago. Instead of the pain and guilt I used to feel when seeing that place, I experienced a sense of peace. Not because I had forgotten what happened, but because I had learned to integrate it into the broader story of my life. I realized that each of us is a story in progress, full of good and bad chapters, of triumphs and failures. The important thing is not to have a perfect story, but to learn from each chapter, and use those lessons to write a better future. As I walked away from the church, I felt a renewed sense of hope and purpose. My story wasn't over. In fact, I felt it was just beginning, and this time, I was determined to write it with wisdom, compassion, and love. Not just for others, but also for myself. Now, as I write these final words, I look to the future with a mixture of excitement and serenity. I don't know exactly what destiny has in store for me, but I know I'm ready to face it, with all the lessons I've learned and all the strength I've gained. My journey of redemption isn't over, and perhaps it never will be completely. But I've learned that that's okay. Life isn't about reaching an unattainable perfection, but about continuously growing, learning from our mistakes, and using our experiences to help others. To all those who are struggling with their own past, with their own mistakes, I say, there is hope. The path may be difficult and long, but it's worth traveling, because in the end, you'll discover that you're stronger than you ever imagined, more resilient than you thought possible. And to myself, to the Sarah who began this journey so many years ago, I say, you've done well. You've faced your demons, you've learned from your mistakes, and you've found a way to use your pain to help others. I'm proud of you. As I close this chapter of my life, I look ahead with hope and determination. I don't know what the future holds, but I know I'm ready to face it, to keep growing, to keep loving. Because after all, that's the essence of life, to love, learn, and grow, no matter how many times we fall along the way. And so with a heart full of gratitude for the lessons learned and hope for what's to come, I close this chapter of my story. But remember, every ending is just the beginning of something new. and I'm ready, more than ever, to see what the next chapter holds for me.